Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barley.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts is my name, Bill Barley's here, and today we talk about a place, one of my favorite spots, and whenever I think of Victoria, I think of a town that just exploded on the scene at the earliest stages of the 18th century and then evolved. Bill Barley, what's your feelings about Victoria?
I look at Fort Victoria, 1843, Hudson's Bay Fort, very, very small town, and then by 1858, it really hits the map. It becomes the center of commerce on the North Pacific coast in the Canadian side, which is really the colonies of Vancouver Island and British Columbia.
Now, when we think of great seaports on the West Coast or great cities of the evolving North America, is it typical of those?
Well, when you look at the great cities of Western North America in the 1850s, there are two great ports, San Francisco and Victoria.
Yeah. And did it evolve the way these other cities did?
Quite similar, Mike.
Yeah.
But with some local influences, obviously.
Yeah. But it didn't have any particular disasters. It wasn't struck by fire, for example. I'm amazed at that.
San Francisco, the fire of, 1906, razed San Francisco, literally did it under. You can look at all the other towns, the great explosions that occurred in the shafts in Nanaimo, the Fernie fire, and you go on, calamity after calamity. Victoria, with one exception, didn't suffer a great, what we would call a calamity.
Okay. Take a look at Victoria. When we come back, some of the people, some of the great photographs, and some of the stories right after these words. Ghost Towns, Mike Roberts and Bill Barley, and we're talking about Victoria today. And really, although it was a sleepy little town in the 1840s, the development that happened then set the scene for the explosion that happened a bit later in Victoria.
And it was a staggering difference in the town. Here's a fort that is kind of somnolent. It's just sitting there in the sun. And suddenly the Fraser River Rush comes into being, and the miners start flooding up from California. Victoria, which has a population of several hundred, it doubles its population when one ship lands. When the next ship, it almost doubles again. Within several weeks, it's quadrupled its population.
And these are the prospectors that are just hurtling into town to try and find something that they can buy that will supply them as they head up the Fraser.
These are the guys heading up the Fraser, and eventually, of course, they go into the Caribou, and then the Caribou Gold Kings are created.
Yeah.
Guys like Caribou Cameron and Billy Cunningham. Now, Billy Cunningham, Mike, he came down to Victoria. He was making, Mike, $2,000 a day then. That's equivalent to $60,000 a working day today. And he was doing that 6 or 7 days a week.
And that was
his share. He was getting gold like this and much heavier. And he'd come down to Victoria. He had a poke full of gold weighing 8 or 10 pounds. And he'd take the nuggets out and throw them against the plate glass window or plate glass mirrors and break the mirrors. Didn't bother. He said, take it out of my poke. And you can bet the owner took more than the mirror was worth.
And this gold, this would be dust to him. I mean, this wouldn't do a darn thing. Sure. So, I mean, contemplate that. And when you say he's making $2,000 a day, it's $2,000 in gold nuggets he's taking out every single day.
Yeah, most of it, of course.
How often would he get to Victoria? I mean, I guess the glass manufacturers loved him.
every winter.
Every winter he'd come down.
Blow his poke. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds he would blow it. And Victoria in those early years, in the late 1850s and the early 1860s, was really a Wild West town. This was an amazing town. You had riots in the theater.
In the theater? Yes. Why would you riot in a theater?
Well, there was a difference between some of the American miners and the police force at the time.
Yeah.
Okay, and the police force was essentially a black police force. And some of the Americans didn't appreciate it. And, of course, Douglas saw fit that he felt the police force was his police force, and there was a considerable difference of opinion. And you had muggings on the main streets. You had a number of killings. You had express companies like Adams and Wells Fargo, which were bitter rivals, not bitter rivals, but definite rivals in California, and they would have races down Main Street to see who could deliver the express first.
Where would they come from? Did they come up from Nanaimo, or
they would come up from the ships.
From the ships down into the harbor.
right into Victoria itself.
And there'd be bets down, I would bet, and the hooting and hollering.
Oh yeah. It was a very wild and woolly town. And it attracted all sorts. It attracted tramp miners, it attracted tin horn gamblers, it attracted businessmen. And by the 1860s, when the Caribou Rush kind of went over the top, in about the mid-1860s, Victoria starts to get a little more sedate, but they still had some very interesting characters. Judge Matthew Bailey Begbie is there.
Sure. This is a seat of government, so all of these people, that would be home port for them.
So-called hanging judge. He sends out circuit judges like Peter O'Reilly and William George Cox and a number of other circuit judges who go through the interior. You had Governor James Douglas, who was really a giant of a man in his day. There's no doubt about that. You had a number of other individuals.
All the gold commissioners, this is where they had to come from, and they had to travel through all of this area in order to keep track of the money.
And as the years go on, you start getting some real entrepreneurs. Robert Dunsmuir, he makes his money in Nanaimo and the Upper Island, but when he retires
to
in
Dunsmuir
Victoria.
Castle, in
Sure.
Dunsmuir
Sure.
Castle in Victoria.
Yeah.
Now, this is the other side that fascinates
Craig
me.
Garrett,
I mean, I can see that guys who had nothing would come and be prospectors, but the people who came to set up the businesses, the suppliers, these guys, where would they come from? From England to the States to North, or where would they come from?
Well,
and why would they leave security for the unknown?
Really, the first individuals who came into Victoria, most of them were from San Francisco and the environs of San Francisco. They came from the state of California. Then a few came from Washington Territory, because that's what it was at that particular time. And then some later on, when the rush became well-known all around the world because of dispatches in the various London papers, they started coming from England and coming from across Canada itself.
And these guys, I mean, there was nothing here. They had to build sawmills to put the wood into place, to build the place. They had to build brickyards. They had to build, and it must have just been a turmoil.
Well, there were some great companies in Victoria at that time. The famous Quang Li, whom we mentioned before in other programs, the Chinese merchant prince,
you called him,
Prince, indeed. He was opposed to the Hudson's Bay Company, and it was just about a saw-off, by the way. And you had a lot of individuals who were a little bit beyond the law. So you had, you had to strike various committees and bring in various police. I don't know what that badge says, Mike.
Special Victoria Police. So this would the guy would get this if there was a sort of an influx of miners. They'd get some special police in.
If there was a potential riot, they would pin a badge on the special police, and they'd come into Victoria itself.
Now, Canada was a less violent place than the United States, but still, with all of what you're telling me, the police definitely had a task at hand trying to deal with all this.
Had their hands full, no doubt about it, Mike, that the police had their hands full in Victoria. And, I think that there was, here's an example. This is a spittoon right from Victoria, Mike, and that's typical of the day. Came from one of the houses of questionable repute in Victoria. And
there were none of those in Victoria, really, were there?
Picked it up some months ago, and gives you an idea of what Victoria was like. But as the years roll on, Mike, Victoria becomes really a bona fide city. It goes from that gold rush status, that wild and woolly sort of town in the 1850s to 1860s. By the 1870s, late 1870s, mid-1870s, and right into the 1880s, it becomes a significant town.
This is a remarkable map. You call this the bird's eye map of Victoria?
This is what is generally known as a bird's eye view, and this is an 1889 bird's eye view.
So the harbor is over here.
Sure.
And all of the Fort Street and all of those places are just up there.
Yep.
So where would the races go? Where did the express companies race up there?
Well, they would probably come up Government Street, actually. But they were in the harbor, so they would probably come in here and race right up Government Street.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly where Wells Fargo's office was, because this is 1889. They're gone by then. But this map indicates some of the buildings here, Mike, and a number of the buildings are rather interesting. There's Spratt's Wharf and Pritchett and Company's Wharf and the Albion Iron Works, and it goes on and mentions some of the banks that have come into Victoria. And, Mike, some absolutely grand mansions.
Yeah.
Because Victoria is where people, once they've made their pile, they come into Victoria to retire.
Now, you've got a shot of one here. This is called the Roslyn. This must be a favorite of yours. Tell me about the Roslyn.
Well, Roslyn was a house built by a guy called Andrew Gray, who was in the ironworks business, actually. And I'm not sure there was Albion Ironworks, but one of the ironworks businesses in Victoria. And he builds himself an absolute mansion. And there it is, complete with witch's cap and some bay windows and all the accoutrements of a very, very fine home. And there were a number of these homes in Victoria. Mike, Victoria had, I think, was the equivalent of San Francisco on the Canadian side. There was house after house after house that was absolutely resplendent. It's just remarkable architecture. Most of them, unfortunately, are gone. A few survive. Craig Derrick is one, and some of the others, but probably only 10% of all those mansions that accumulated on the posh areas of Victoria.
Yeah. So you've got shots of downtown, Fort Street and Government Street. Here, Fort Street, you've got Mr. Bagnall and his music shop, and you've got really substantial brick buildings in this area.
Sure you have. Wells Fargo would have been along here. There's what they would have posted, Mike, for sure.
Got this, is this an actual poster from the Wells Fargo days?
Actual poster from Wells Fargo. That would be in every office. And Wells Fargo had hundreds of offices spread throughout the western United States, started in 1852, and went till the Union Pacific really wrecked Wells Fargo. So that would be the early 1860s. And, but they did last in other out-of-the-way areas. And you can read some of this, Mike, and I think it's fascinating reading.
Yeah, I mean, it says right here, 10 days to San Francisco and California Gold Camps, the average speed 5 miles an hour. Boy, that's humming right along. Yeah. And notice, California and eastbound passengers, recommended equipment for the overland passengers, so they've got tips right here, 1 Sharps rifle, 100 cartridges, a Colt Navy revolver, 2 pounds of balls, a knife, a sheath, a pair of thick boots, woolen pants. They've got the tips right there.
And look at the ship too, Mike. Somewhere in there it says
gold dust, coin, U.S. mail, banknotes. Sure. Also the collection of gold dust, coins, nuggets, drafts, and accounts. I mean, they did everything, and they became the banker of the time, I guess.
No doubt about it. So what happens to Victoria is what happens to any town that grows at that rate in about 30 years. By the 1870s, it becomes a city with all the embellishments of a city. And by the late 1870s, it is probably, of course, Vancouver does not exist, doesn't really come into being until 1880s. And Victoria is the town on the Pacific Slope. There's not much doubt about it. Nothing really touches it. Sure, there are other places like Barkerville. There are other places here and there like Yale, but really nothing compares with Victoria.
And this is the thing that I was reminded of on my last trip to Victoria. The Maritime Museum is a fascinating place to go. When you look at the shipping that came in here, it wasn't like 1 or 2 lonely sailing boats. It was hundreds of boats coming into the Victoria Harbor.
Well, as we mentioned before, Victoria Harbor was one of the great harbors of the Pacific coast. There's not much doubt about it. Equivalent in some respects to San Francisco. Yeah. And these were the 2 best. Of course, Seattle comes on the scene much later. But there were boats coming from not only from the United States, not only from coming around the Horn, which a lot of them came around the Horn. Some of them are starting to come across from Australia, and some are starting to come from Hong Kong. So they're bringing in Chinese, they're bringing in Australian miners, they're bringing in American miners, and they're bringing in an increasing business class.
And when you talk about these, by the 30 years of the boom going by, you must have been getting some pretty sophisticated society in Victoria by then.
Oh, there's no doubt about it, that there was an elite in Victoria of probably 20 or 30 families. And this elite, of course, is led by Governor James Douglas, who is half black, by the way, rather interesting, and his Indian wife, whom he had married in the Fort St. James area. And yet they are leaders of society. So it was an egalitarian society in many respects. And he is a very austere individual, but there are many others on the second tier.
I mean, if you've got it,
Lady Begbie is one of them.
Yeah. And of course, all of the merchant who became pillars of the community. If you got it, flaunt it. They built their houses and they partied it up.
Sure.
This is one of your treasures, isn't it? You've got a number of these beauties.
Yeah.
Gold nugget chain. This one's only about 3 feet long. How many ounces of gold in this?
But just about 2 ounces.
2 ounces.
And that's typical of the chains that some of the women in high society in Victoria would have worn. Also, some of the women in other parts of society would have worn the same thing, which is rather interesting. But gold really knows no barriers in that respect. And of course, this was typical of the day. And of course, the gold pokes, everybody worth their salt would carry a gold poke. This one is rather interesting, Mike. It still has 84 ounces on it.
It's written right there. So a poke this size, tightened up at the end, would have 84 ounces of gold in it?
Not necessarily. What you didn't notice here is there was a seal on that.
Yeah.
And that seal would be probably put down there and then sealed over top by the bank, whether it was the Bank of British Columbia or whatever bank it was.
Yeah.
They would seal that, and then the guy would come in and say, okay, the seal has not been broken. I still have my 84 ounces. And he might weigh it out in front of the banker. If he didn't trust the bank, generally speaking, if the seal was intact, he watched it put on, he severed the seal, he broke the seal himself, and then he would probably say, yeah, this is 84 ounces.
84 ounces.
Now, the interesting thing, Mike, is this was only worth about $16 crude ounce. So 84 ounces was not worth a lot of money. It was worth about not quite $1,500. Today, it's worth 30 times that.
And the guy would carry how many? And when you think about the Cunningham, he got $2,000 a week out of this.
A day?
A day. This is one of these a day.
Oh, yeah. More than that. Much more. Much more.
And he'd come to Victoria.
He would have 10 pounds a day, approximately.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And as you say, if we were to look at the society of the time, it's maybe 20 families that are the core of the merchant class, of the legal class, and then all of the other people around the world.
Yeah, this expands with some of the retirees coming in from England, the admirals and then the generals, and a lot of the stuff they had, Mike, I think is, this is the sort of material that they had in Victoria, and I think it's typical of the day.
Yeah.
I mean, you won't get a doorknob and a plate like that.
I mean, this was a step above Barkerville, was it?
Finest of brass compared to the other brass, by the way, too, Mike.
Yeah. So the whole town burgeoned, and by the 70s, 1870s, and still Vancouver just a slough and a swamp.
Yeah.
It's just going great guns.
You bet it is.
All right, I'll go right. Talking about Victoria and the situation that just sort of precedes the tragedy we're going to allude to. What's happening in British Columbia 1875?
Well, Mike, Caribou has passed its peak. The Amanika Rush has passed its peak. But there's another rush, this is the Cassia Rush, which is really at the height of its peak. The Cassia Rush is bringing out what we call the Gold Kings. And what was the habit of the Gold Kings in the fall of each year, October or November, was to travel to Victoria, and if they had enough money, they would then go on to San Francisco.
And they'd come out of the gold fields of the Cassiar district with, what did you need in order to really fly the flag, show what a gold king you were?
If a guy could afford to go to Victoria, he'd probably have 5 or 10 pounds. If he could afford to go to San Francisco, he would have 20 pounds, 25 pounds, maybe as much as 50 pounds of gold nuggets.
And he'd be carrying it in pokes like we showed you earlier, those leather bags.
Didn't trust the express company. So the date is very important. November the 5th, 1875. Another calm day in Victoria. Victoria's great. Calm seas. A lot of the individuals had traveled down from the Cassiar, so the Argonauts are in Victoria. They're waiting for the next ship to go to San Francisco. And the next ship happens to be the SS Pacific. Now, the SS Pacific has an interesting background. It had been in the Fraser River Rush. It was a side-wheeler. It had been retired in 1872, but because of the Cassiar Rush, Mike, pressed back into service 1874. It was not seaworthy. It was a rotten hulk. And the guy in charge of it, Jefferson D. Howell, and Jefferson Davis Howell, actually, a brother-in-law to Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. And so a lot of people from Victoria board, Garish of Garish and Green, who was one of Wells Fargo's agents, Moody of Moodyville, and Parsons of Fraser River fame, and a lot of the social elite, they board the ship with tickets. A lot of the Argonauts don't even bother. They go on with gold dust. They buy their way on this boat. There's a crew of about 48, Mike, and there's a passenger list. We know the passenger list was not complete. Well over 200 people. The decks of this ship were black with people. So it goes out of Victoria Harbor on a calm day. Now, in that area, it's an area it's the graveyard of the North Atlantic in many respects, but this was a perfect day. Or North Pacific, excuse me. But this was a perfect day. And so they without any incident at all, they travel out of Victoria Harbor, and they go up Juan de Fuca Strait, and they start rounding Cape Flattery. Now, Cape Flattery can be very tough. It wasn't. It was a perfect day. But up from the south, sails a collier, and in charge of a guy called Captain Charles Sawyer. And Sawyer, for some reason, we don't know whose fault it was, because Sawyer would not admit it afterwards, there's just a grazing contact made between the Pacific and the Orpheus. And there's no collision, just a graze, but it was enough to cave in the hull of the Pacific. And it happened so quickly, and the surprising thing was that Sawyer kept on sailing north. He didn't even bother north, and then he was going to turn into the Strait of Juan de Fuca.
So the Orpheus just sailed right on.
Most of the people came up on the deck. They heard they heard it slightly.
Bump, yeah.
weren't too concerned about it. The ship started taking in water immediately. They don't even have time to launch their lifeboats. The ship turns turtle and sinks virtually with all hands on board.
250 dead on a calm day.
Yeah. 2 survivors, Mike, only 2. Henry Jelly, who's the passenger, and Neil Henley, who's the quartermaster. Those are the only 2 out of those 250, at least 250 people who went to watery grave. And, you know, it was a tragic sort of thing because the stories, virtually everyone in Victoria was affected. They all lost relatives or friends. And there was a Miss Fanny Palmer who had been sent to San Francisco that very day. Within some hours later, her body is washed up within yards of her family's home, the Digby Palmers.
Oh,
so really quite tragic. And I estimated.
What happened to the guy Orpheus, the captain of the Orpheus is Sawyer? Because I mean, this is against the law of the sea to leave a boat that you've just clipped.
Well, it's strange. It's one of the twists in this tale. He continues on towards Nanaimo, and his boat wrecks off Point Beale about just a few hours later and sinks.
And Sawyer survives? Does Sawyer tell any
survives,
story?
yeah, but they're not very happy with Sawyer, and he tried to say he didn't see it and so on, and everyone knows he did.
So Victoria is obviously, everybody's wearing black in Victoria.
Yeah.
But the story as we look back on this tragedy is that there is a treasure at the bottom. You've got a map here. Now this map is done known wrecks since 1800. A guy by the name of Carson did this map. Now maybe we could just sort of chart the route that this took. So there's the title of it, and there's we are at Victoria Harbor. So the Pacific leaves here and steams out Juan de Fuca, rounds Cape Flattery, and that's where it it's clipped by the Orpheus.
That's right, but they think it's lying, the remains of this wreck are lying at about 12 fathoms, which is about 70 feet, Mike, and worth $100,000 at the time. Multiply that by at least 30, about a $3 million treasure. I think that this treasure, which would be gold rings and diamond rings and gold coins and placer gold and everything else, is one of the great sunken treasures, probably the greatest sunken treasure on the Pacific Northwest coast.
And that's saying something, because that map we looked at, I think there are, 200 wrecks on this piece, and that doesn't count all of the wrecks.
That's right.
And
there are at least 500 in this general area. And several hundred are on this particular map, Mike. Gives you an idea of how dangerous that area is, because there were fogs, there were high seas. It was very, very tough sailing ground.
And that's what makes this tragedy even more unbelievable, because it happened in a clear day, and there was every chance of saving everybody. Why did Sawyer do it? Any concept? Any?
No, the reporters reported it in the paper, but there was no explanation from Sawyer.
Great story out of Victoria and a shipwreck, and that's Gold Trails for today. See you next time. Bye-bye.